Hello, today we're talking about Gene Wolfe's Sorcerer's House. It's been a long time since I made a video like this, so you're going to have to bear with me just a little bit as I try to get back in the swing of things here. So, real quickly, I want to go over what I think is the issue with some of Wolfe's late work. Part of it is that I think so much of his emphasis moved to subtext, away from text itself. And so everything after, even Short Sun, right? Wizard Knight, Land Across, Evil Guest, Borrowed Man, all of those books, including Sorcerer's House, there's a lot under the surface that's very difficult to kind of unearth. And are the surface narratives really enough to justify all that digging you have to do? I think definitely so in the case of the Sorcerer's House, right? This is probably the most fun thing that Wolfe wrote in his late career. I think it works whether you dig into it or not. There's still a lot to get there. And so, I feel like, unfortunately, for some, right, that there really is a definite solution that he's working towards, that these are puzzle box narratives. And I think that's true for everything, including Short Sun and after. So, almost the last 20 years that he was writing, I feel like he really embraced that puzzle box aspect to his writing there. And that, you might miss a lot of it. So I'm going to present a reading of Sorcerer's House that I think is what Wolfe intended, right? I really honestly believe that this was the solution. This was how he planned the novel there. And so normally, I actually don't like to resort to external illusions except as a last resort, unless they're religious in nature. But in the case of the Sorcerer's House, I feel that it is inevitable, almost, that we have to confront a lot of those myths and stories to actually get at the bottom of what Wolfe is trying to do. So on the surface, right, we have Baxter Dunn coming to Medicine Man, this town, and somehow inheriting this mysterious house there. And he's a twin brother. Right, his brother George is married, and there's a lot of animosity between them. And Baxter Dunn is an ex-con, right? So he's just got out of prison. How did he get, the resources to do what he's doing here? And there's a whole lot of things that are going on in this particular book that, lead one to believe either, right, that Baxter Dunn is making up the house and everything else and conning his brother, or that it's legitimate and there actually are all these mystical things that are going on there, and that he is actually kind of the heir of someone from Fairy, more or less, this land that's kind of adjacent to the real world there that you can enter in, and time flows perhaps differently there. However, I do think that Wolfe wrote this with a third solution in mind, the true solution that's underneath it. And so we get a metaphor for how to read this book in the form of the triannulus, which is kind of this little magical sextant almost, really, where you line it up, right? You line up the images on the three rings of the triannulus there, and it produces some result when you light the candle and acquire Newman. So that's kind of the magical system that's at work in this particular book. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details that my write-up on this does, but I'm going to include a link at the bottom here that's good for a month if you wanted to download that and read it at length, because there's so many small details that I think contribute to this triple structure that it actually is a metaphor for the way of reading the book. And another one that we get is Madame Maurizia, right? The fortune teller who comes and also perhaps seems to be maybe scamming Bax. Well, she's not, right? She gives him a couple bits of advice. And so I want to reveal, to start off with, right, a letter that Millie, George's wife, wrote to Bax. So this is his sister-in-law that he seems to be interested in. And really, sometimes when he's writing to George, it's an epistolary novel. He's writing to Millie instead to kind of get her on his side and kind of soften her up. And so Madame Maurizia is originally her psychic advisor. Okay, and this is what she says. So I talked all this over with Madame Maurizia. She's my psychic advisor. I said, do you think George will hurt his poor brother? She tried the cards and looked terribly frightened. After that, the little crystal. That's the real one, as she told me 2 years ago. There's a big one, too. It's plastic, but it looks like crystal. It tells everybody what they want to hear. She uses that one all the time. But the little one is real. She said she saw great danger for George and his brother. You, too. Be careful. That's on page 114 in this version here. And so I think this is a metaphor for actually how to read this story, because we have long letters that are written to his brother and that are written to Millie, and then short letters that are written to his old inmate friend in jail. Now, there are some things that appear in both letters. There are some things that never appear in any but the long letters, and this includes the twin brothers that he finds in the house, Emlyn and Yeyin, right, according to the way that that's pronounced in the book, as far as I can tell. So those brothers don't appear in the short letters to his inmate friend. And this is interesting. So because the way the triangulus works, there are things on the inner ring which are repeated on the outside rings. But there are things on those outside rings that are kind of added there, and they're not repeated. And so I think this is a metaphor for how to read the text, and that the things on the inner ring are true. The problem is, right, that Quarn the dwarf appears in letters from Madame Maurizia, very short letters, and to Rose, right, the woman that he's kind of interested in there. That's her middle name. So in any case, how do we reconcile that the two brothers who appear in the house don't appear at all when he's writing to his inmate friend? And I think that part of this is actually understandable through the references at the end. So I was reading through this, right, and I said, okay, there are certain things I don't understand. I understand the triplicate structure of the book. So, for example, he finds 3 regular coins in a like a sofa that he's sitting in, right, and it's 55 cents. That would be 2 quarters and a nickel. Okay, there's 3 of them there. Later on, he finds 3 golden coins, and one of them is a Corinthian coin, and he tries to kind of pawn them to get some money for them. And then later on, he's sitting on his mattress and he finds all kind of money in his mattress there, right? And so there's 3 iterations of finding money. One of them is very mundane and it's ordinary, and it's probably the truth, right? The other one is kind of built on that. It's 3 coins that are kind of fantastic in nature, and the Corinthian coin is so interesting because when people look at it, they can't agree on whether the head is male or female. And this gold coin is going to be one of the central key motifs in this particular story, and it actually was one of the things I originally couldn't explain. There were several things I couldn't explain. The other thing that's going to seem to be triplicated is that originally we had a story of a butler, right, that is told. And this butler here appeared kind of in the story of John the Baptist, where he was like bringing in the head on a tray there. So he predated Christ to some degree, right? And then eventually we're going to have a butler who seems to be eventually revealed as Mr. Black show up, who is more or less the guy who's bequeathing his property to back, supposedly from Fairy. And then we get a third butler, right, this Nicholas guy, who's described very strangely. He's trapped in the trunk there. He has that stench associated with him, just like Lupine, right, that werewolf figure that appears in this. She also has a stench associated with her. And so Madame Maurizia actually does wind up being the key, because at one point she asks Bax, it's important that you pay attention to who is around when you're experiencing certain supernatural things. Is there a sense of coldness? Is there an odor? So both, right, the butler and Lupine are associated with an odor. And this is going to be very important to getting to the bottom of things, because ultimately that Corinthian coin, which seems to have a male and a female head, is going to be associated with gold. And at the very end scenes, the gold scepter or staff, really, that Mr. Black appears with, which was also like a gold-tipped kind of pistol brace as well. It kind of has multiple iterations throughout for the guns that the boys are going to use to possibly duel. That's bequeathed to them in the will at the end there. And so this gold actually winds up being a symbol of something, and it's kind of metonymically related through the gold coin, through that gold-tipped staff, and it shows us the relationships and who was actually influencing Bax at any given point, because a lot of the talk between he and those twin boys, Emlyn and Yeyin, who appear in the house, and one has a hot temper and one has a cold temper, but it's not clear sometimes who's who, right? They may have been switched even at the beginning there. A lot of the talk is about shaking hands with them. And so at the start, he shakes hands with one of them, and at the end, he's like, I find that I can't shake hands when I find myself in a false position. And what has happened in that, Emlyn supposedly has fallen under the sway of his girlfriend, Lupine. And so that's where that second handshake kind of shows up. But there are several other things that we need to talk about to contextualize this story, because as it is, we're left with, okay, Is Bax actually, conning his brother? Or is this all legitimate? He still might be taking the place of his brother at the very end. And I think that's the conclusion we're supposed to come to. At the end, he talks about, I'll embrace him, right? I'll shake his hand as brothers do. Well, he's already talked about not being able to do that when he's in a false position. And so it's pretty clear that he's going to take the place of his brother, right? Because at the end, he starts talking about Dickens and all the stuff that Bax alone is interested in, and that he is kind of going after Millie, his brother's wife. So he's gotten rid of him somehow. There's another story, though, in Fairy that didn't make much sense to me at the end originally, right? And that was the story of Ambrosius, who was supposedly strangled and thrown in the river. And then there is another interesting thing in the small letters to his inmate. These guys appear, and one of them seems to be some Greek guy, right? And the other one is a skinny torpedo of a guy who has funny hands that unsettle his inmate friend, right? And so the stories of the butler who drinks the blood of children actually date back into the newspapers from the time that Bax was born. And so this seems to be an external source that we can kind of trace. So at the end of it, I was like, okay, Madame Maurizia says that the real source of the problem is locked in the trunk, right? Who was locked in the trunk? That vampiric butler was locked in the trunk. She also, right, says, hey, get rid of it somehow. Okay, she gives the advice that the small crystal is a legitimate one. When we look at the triangulus, right, it seems to be that the small letters show the truth. Corn appears in the small letters. What else appears? Well, the two brothers don't. Why? Because they are kind of a manifestation of an internal struggle that Bax is facing. But this is not entirely based on something that we could discern from the text alone. And so at the end I was left with, how can I explain this Corinthian coin? How can I explain Ambrosius and what happened to him? How can I explain the stench? And how is it that this blood drinker seemed to exist before Bax was born? What's the deal with all this? And so I was like, okay, he's Greek. Let's look up Greek blood drinkers. The first thing that came up was the Lamia of Corinth. But before we go to that, there was a realization I had in the middle chapters when he's kind of out and there's like this weird scene where he's going to the restaurant and he encounters this woman, this spectral woman on the side of the road named Kiki. And she seems to repeat everything, right? She kind of reverses the order. She's like, not far from home. Home is close, right? She kind of repeats everything. This is actually the central chapter of the book. I was like, what is this Kiki? Well, a Kikimora is a house spirit that, if it's pleased, can send pleasant visions and dreams and appear as the owner of a house, right? So a Kikimora is a house spirit. And now, if it's displeased, it starts to do weird things like creating all this ruckus so you can't sleep. It even starts sending dreams. And another thing that happens with Inari spirits, right, is that they can also send visions and dreams, this fox spirit that he finds there. And so on the robe that is gifted to the Inari Winker, right, or Winkle, or however you want to say it there, there's actually a picture of a fox chasing off a rabbit. Later on, when he gets to Doris's keychains, there's a rabbit dangling from them, right? And so a lot of people have been suspicious of Doris, but one of the things that these spirits do is they create discord between the house owner and his romantic interest because they become jealous. And so the Kikimora and the Inari can both kind of be implicated in this particular plot to get rid of Doris as an interest, because in the pattern of 2 and 1, which you're going to see way more clearly in the write-up, right, that I put down there, you see that there seems to be several spirits at work. It's not just one spirit. There are multiple spirits. And one of them might even be Martha Murray, because he talks about her handshake, right? How her handshake is firm. And that's one of the ways that you can identify whether the house spirit, right, the Kikimora spirit, and its associated spirits that are there with it, right, whether it's satisfied or not. And so you can look up more about the house spirits in that essay that I've given you right there. But more important than that, right, is as I was looking up blood drinkers, I saw the Lamia of Corinth. So if you look up the story of the Lamia of Corinth and Apollonius, this is a story in which the Lamia, who is associated with a particular stench, right? You can trace her down in her lair by how she smells. She has the ability to create an entire house with servants and all as an illusion to drain her victims. And this is, how is she stopped? This wonder worker, Apollonius, is able to tear through the illusions. Then I realized, wait a minute here. We've got the Corinthian coin. The Lamia of Corinth is lupine. The Lamia of Corinth is Nicholas. The Corinthian coin that seems to be both genders. When you look at the mythology, one of the most noxious elements ever, supposedly, in historical sources, were Lamia's testicles, because she's of ambiguous gender as well. And so we have the sense that the Lamia is draining backs and will drain backs, and that she is the blood drinker Nicholas. She is lupine, and that this time there is no Ambrosius or Apollonius to stop her and cut through the illusions. Bax is fooled by this. So I really recommend that you look up the Lamia of Corinth, because it explains the coin. It explains Ambrosius as Apollonius. It explains the strangling hands, right? And why that blood drinker is a skinny torpedo, because it's serpentine. The Lamia is one of these serpentine things. And also it explains the house itself. And we know then that Bax has actually been conned by two malevolent spirits. The Kikimora, which brings nightmares. That's what it actually means. And that's why he seems to be asleep at certain scenes in there, right? These dreams that are being sent to him from the Kikimora, this house spirit, which is probably Martha Murray, based on some things that she says at the beginning, and her handshake as well. And when the Kikimora is angry, right, the sense that the temperatures start to change as well, and the ruckus that they bring really matches pretty well with some of the other things that are happening in the house. So the two boys were never real. There isn't really fairy in this particular tale. This is where Bax has been conned by house spirits, right? The Kikimora and the Lamia of Corinth. And he's going to be drained. He's not going to see through the illusion. Manjushri, right? That bodhisattva that he kind of encounters there. He doesn't pierce the illusion. He's kind of sucked into it. And a lot of the symbolism, a lot of it that we see, like for example, the first time he goes into the room of Yeyin, supposedly, he sees a fox skin there. Right, and he also sees a little dwarf chained up, and that's going to be used later, because it's not actually Inari that is this benevolent friend of his. She's actually driving away Doris Rose, and so that would have been his salvation, right? If he actually formed a relationship with her, but instead he suckered into betraying his brother and going with Millie instead. And with the handwriting, right, when he looks at the corporation's geese that kind of gave him the house there, he says, wow, it's a female's handwriting, because Martha Murray is kind of a manifestation of that. What does she say at the start when he first meets her and she kind of makes food for him? That's something that the Kikimora also does. It's kind of this domestic house spirit. She says to him, I was a real nightmare when I was done traveling. And so we do get the sense, right? Kikimora means nightmare as well. So there's a lot of things that are repeated that I'm not going to go into in this particular video just because, but the triplicate structure is so important, including the fish, right? And so the fish symbol on there can mean, on the triannulus, can also be the rune for property, right? So there's so many things that are going on there, but the triannulus kind of symbolizes a lot of things that are going on in the text, including the moon. The Lamia is also associated with Enodia or Hecate, as Wolfe draws those comparisons in Latro and the Mist. And so some of the things actually might be associated with the phases of the moon, such as the fact that every time it gets darker, the power goes out. Somebody like Kate Finn shows up. So she might actually be another manifestation of that, like the dark version of it. So his senses have been impacted by this. The two brothers, Yeyin and Emlyn, they're not real. They're the internal struggle that he's facing. And when when Emlyn actually falls victim to Lupine's machinations, that is Bax falling sway to the Lamia of Corinth's illusions. So if you look up those myths, it really does make sense what Wolfe was doing here. And I think that that's the palimpsest is there might be two possible solutions here, but really the third solution is the right one, right? And that's the pattern that is embedded in this, whether it be rings or spirits. What's the actual legitimate spirit that's on his side? Gold's ghost, right? Ted Gold's ghost is the thing that's actually on his side there. And so the rest of the stuff in Fairy is indicative of that story of the Lamai of Corinth and Apollonius. And so I was able to explain the things that were sticking out. Unfortunately, right, first I had to look at the structures and see, okay, what's left? What is it pointing toward? And all of Madame Mauritius' suggestions, everything that she said, right, even the structure of the book where it doubles the tarot, I think points to the idea that the fortune teller is telling you actually what you need to know to solve it. And she does say that. But then you have to start looking outside. Okay, there's a Greek blood drinker that seems to be maybe predating Christ, since he was there with John the Baptist. He was there before Bax was born. So what's going on with that? When I looked it up, I knew instantly, right? The Lamai of Corinth solved all of my problems, including my confusion about who Ambrosius was. He's Apollonius. Including my confusion about the golden coin that seemed to be of two genders. The stench that Lupine and Nicholas tried to share. They're manifestations of the same malevolent entity. And Bax is ultimately going to be drained and destroyed. That's why he disappeared. So there's no ambiguity in his death. The Lamai of Corinth triumphed in this particular tale. So in any case, please look over the write-up there. I go far more into detail than I can in these videos. I'm trying to get back into the swing of things, but I do think that Wolfe's late fiction is written such that there is a plausible reading, there's the one underneath it, and then there's that real solution that actually explains the small details, and it has to explain almost everything, including why Bax is asleep in certain scenes, right? And why there's that stench, and how this house actually seems to affect other people. It's not a con, right? There are real supernatural things. What's the con? The fact that he's going to inherit anything from Fairy. Martha Murray and Lupine, they can't really deliver what they're promising, right? He is the victim, but he's also going to victimize his brother and take his place. So I think I'm going to do Evil Guest next. I'll go more into detail with the text there. I just wanted to present the idea in these late works of Wolfe that you can read them on the surface level and enjoy them. They're great fun. But I do think he's writing with a very particular solution. Sometimes you can come to it through structure. Sometimes when all those close readings, you read it over and over again, fail, you have to resort to looking at mythology or some external reference. And that's usually my last resort. In this case, I needed it to solve the book, in my opinion. You may or may not agree with me, but I do think that it does make sense of details that otherwise are inexplicable in this, right? That so much of it is actually internal to Bax and what he's experiencing due to the illusions of Lamai and the Kikimora. So I'm going to include that right up there. Hopefully you can check it out. Thank you for listening. Take care.